In the 1854 portrait, the child sits as children were made to sit then. Chin lifted by an unseen brace, eyes fixed on a point just above the lens, as if taught to look past the present. The photograph had survived wars, fires, careless moves between archives. It had been catalogued, indexed, footnoted. Historians praised the crispness of the coat, the early mastery of light, the melancholy patience of the subject. No one lingered on the right hand resting in his lap. Until it was enlarged. At higher resolution, the hand refuses to behave. The fingers bend with a patience that feels practiced, the knuckles swollen not by age or illness, but by something else, something deliberate. The skin shows faint ridges where no ridges should be, pale grooves that interrupt the grain of the image like scars remembered by the silver itself. It is too large for the wrist that carries it, as though it belongs to a future the rest of the boy never reached. What unsettles restorers most is not the deformity, but the care. The photographer framed it gently, allowed light to kiss it longer than the face. This was no accident of exposure. Someone wanted the hand to be seen, just not yet. In the archive ledger, the portrait is marked with a thin dash where notes should be. Not erased, not redacted, simply absent. Letters from the period circle the image without touching it, praising composition, lamenting the boy's short life, then falling abruptly silent. The silence is consistent, repeated across decades, across languages, across scholars who otherwise disagreed on everything. Early photography demanded stillness, but this stillness feels imposed. The longer one studies the hand, the more it seems to press outward, as if testing the boundary between the boy's world and ours. The question is not why historians missed it. The question is why, after seeing it, they chose not to speak at all. When the restoration expert first loaded the 1854 portrait onto the high-resolution monitor, there was no sense of discovery, only routine. The glass plate had suffered a hairline fracture, the kind that crept through 19th century photographs like a wrinkle through skin, and the task was simply to stabilize, clean, and enlarge enough to preserve detail before time erased it completely. At its original size, the image was familiar, almost comforting in its age. A seated boy, no older than 10, dressed in a stiff dark coat, posture rigid from the iron stand hidden behind him, eyes dulled by the long exposure. Hundreds of such portraits existed. This one should have been no different. The software rendered the face first, revealing pores, lashes, a faint tremor in the lip from the effort of remaining still. Then, the image panned downward, and the hand began to resolve. At low magnification, it had seemed ordinary, folded politely in the lap, fingers overlapping as many children were instructed to do. But as the enlargement increased, proportion quietly unraveled. The hand was too broad for the forearm, the palm extending with a fullness that did not match the child's narrow shoulders. The fingers were long, yet thickened at the joints, as though shaped by years of strain a boy of that age could not have known. More disturbing than the size was the symmetry, or rather the lack of it. Each finger bent, at a slightly different angle, not randomly, but with the suggestion of intent. As if frozen mid-gesture, the thumb rested unnaturally low, pressing into the palm with a pressure that seemed almost active despite the stillness of the image. As contrast levels were adjusted, faint lines emerged along the skin, shallow grooves that did not follow creases or veins. They formed patterns that felt wrong, not chaotic but unfamiliar, like a language nearly remembered. The restorer leaned closer, aware of an inexplicable tightness in the chest, the sensation that accompanies the realization of having already overlooked something important. Early photography was unforgiving. It captured exactly what was placed before it. There was no mechanism in 1854 to invent detail at this scale. Whatever the hand showed, it had been there when the shutter opened. The most unsettling realization came not from anatomy, but from composition. The light fell more generously on the hand than on the boy's face, as if the photographer had subtly angled the subject to ensure it would not be lost in shadow. The sleeve had been adjusted, the cuff pulled back just enough to reveal the wrist. This was not neglect. This was emphasis. Someone in that room, more than a century and a half ago, had seen the hand clearly and decided it deserved to be preserved with care far exceeding that given to the child himself. The search for context began in the quietest part of the archive, where correspondence was kept not for display but for obligation, bundled and labeled with dates rather than names. Letters from historians, curators, and early photographic scholars spanned decades, some written in precise academic script, others hurried, ink bleeding into thin paper. At first glance, they seemed thorough. The portrait was referenced repeatedly, praised as an early example of technical competence, cited in discussions about exposure times, seating devices, and the social customs of mid-19th century portraiture. Yet the more closely the letters were read, the more conspicuous a single omission became. None of them described the boy's right hand. This absence was not the result of indifference. These same historians dissected the smallest details elsewhere, noting the tension in the boy's jaw, speculating about the family's class from the cut of the coat, even arguing over whether the child was ill or merely exhausted by the long sitting. One letter devoted 3 paragraphs to the texture of the backdrop cloth. Another debated the symbolic meaning of the chair. But when the text reached the point where the folded hands should have been mentioned, the sentences bent away, redirecting attention with almost practiced ease. It was as though every writer felt the need to acknowledge the lower half of the image without ever naming what was there. Marginal notes deepened the unease. In several documents, a faint pencil mark appeared near references to the portrait, a small dash or circle that seemed meaningless until its repetition was noticed. The marks never appeared beside other images. Only this one. In a 1912 letter, a respected historian ended abruptly mid-thought, the final line trailing into an ink blot, followed by a polite closing that felt hurried, out of character. In another, dated 1937, a curator mentioned, "A detail better left unremarked," before crossing out the phrase so heavily the paper nearly tore. The crossed-out words were still faintly legible beneath the graphite, preserved like a confession that could not quite be erased. More telling still were the gaps in official records. Exhibition catalogs listed the portrait, but omitted the usual descriptive captions. Conservation reports described chemical stability and surface damage in meticulous detail, yet skipped anatomical observations entirely. These were not mistakes repeated by chance. They formed a pattern of collective restraint, an unspoken agreement carried forward by people who had never met one another, bound only by the object they had all examined. The silence suggested awareness rather than ignorance. Each historian had stood before the same image, at some point noticing what could not be unseen, and then choosing language that stepped carefully around it. The archive did not feel incomplete. It felt guarded, as though the true subject of the portrait had been sealed away not by law or decree, but by a shared understanding that some details, once spoken aloud, did not remain confined to the page. The decision to subject the portrait to chemical analysis was made reluctantly, framed as a technical necessity rather than a search for answers no one quite wanted. The glass plate was removed from its protective sleeve under controlled light. The air filtered, gloves changed twice. Early photographic emulsions were well understood, their weaknesses catalogued through years of conservation work. and the expectation was simple: confirm age, identify contaminants, document decay. What emerged instead challenged the most basic assumptions about how the image had come into being. Spectrographic scans of the silver halide layer revealed irregularities, concentrated almost entirely around the boy's right hand. The distribution of silver particles there was denser, more complex, as if the emulsion had been encouraged to react differently in that region. This was not consistent with light exposure alone. Environmental damage, fungal growth, or later retouching could account for uneven degradation, but none of those explanations matched the precision of what appeared under analysis. The boundaries were too clean, the transitions too intentional. Whatever had altered the image had done so before the plate was fully exposed, while the chemicals were still receptive, still capable of being guided. Further tests uncovered trace compounds embedded within the emulsion, substances known in the mid-19th century but rarely used outside experimental contexts. These compounds had the effect of slowing the photographic reaction in targeted areas, allowing finer detail to emerge where it otherwise would have blurred. The implication was unsettling. Someone had interfered with the chemical process itself, manipulating the plate so that one part of the subject would record with unnatural clarity. This was not correction or restoration performed decades later. It was preparation. Historical manuals confirmed the possibility. A handful of early photographers, working on the fringes of accepted practice, had experimented with treating plates to emphasize specific features. These techniques were unstable, risky, and largely abandoned because of their unpredictability. Yet the portrait bore their signature unmistakably. The hand had been given priority long before the boy ever sat down. The plate altered in advance, as though the photographer already knew what would need to be preserved. The realization reframed every earlier assumption. If the hand's prominence was intentional at a chemical level, then it was not merely a physical anomaly captured by chance. It was the reason the photograph existed in its final form. The boy's face, his posture, even his presence became secondary to that single detail, elevated through methods that demanded knowledge, effort, and forethought. This was not the work of someone documenting a subject. It was the work of someone preparing a record. The most troubling aspect was the silence surrounding such experimentation. No surviving notes mentioned the use of altered emulsions for this portrait. No contemporaries criticized or praised the technique. It existed in isolation, a lone example of a process that should have left traces elsewhere. The absence suggested not failure, but concealment, as if the method itself, once used, was never meant to be repeated or discussed again. The second portrait surfaced by accident, uncovered during a routine digitization of a regional archive whose contents had rarely been cross-referenced with larger collections. It was misfiled among civic records, its glass plate wrapped in brittle paper, labeled only with a date matching the first image. At first glance, it appeared to be a different photograph altogether. The backdrop was plainer, the lighting harsher, the framing slightly off-center, suggesting a photographer with less finesse or fewer resources. Yet the boy was unmistakable. The same narrow face, the same distant gaze, the same stiffness imposed by early photographic restraint. Even the coat, worn at the elbows in identical places, confirmed that this was not merely a similar subject, but the same child, captured again. What should have made the discovery impossible was distance. The studio identified in the ledger was hundreds of miles away from the one that produced the original portrait, in a town the boy's family had no recorded ties to. Travel of that scale in 1854 was slow, expensive, and uncommon, especially for a child of modest means. There was no documentation explaining how or why he might have been photographed twice in the same year, by two different photographers under circumstances that left no trace in census records or personal correspondence. The logistics alone strained credibility. When the image was enlarged, any remaining hope of coincidence dissolved. The boy's right hand was positioned differently, resting slightly higher, fingers more openly displayed, yet its proportions were identical. The same unnatural breadth, the same uneven bend of the fingers, the same faint markings visible when contrast was adjusted. Even the light behaved similarly, drawn toward the hand with a subtle insistence that mirrored the first photograph. Two photographers, working independently, had both chosen to emphasize the same detail with almost reverent care. There were differences that only deepened the unease. In the second portrait, the boy's expression was more strained, his eyes less focused, as though the act of being photographed again had exacted a cost. The hand, by contrast, appeared more defined, its lines sharper, its presence more commanding within the frame. If the first image suggested intention, the second suggested continuation, as though the process begun earlier was being completed or reinforced. Attempts to trace a connection between the two studios yielded nothing. The photographers had no shared apprenticeships, no overlapping exhibitions, no correspondence that survived. Yet both had access to similar experimental methods, techniques rarely documented and even more rarely preserved in practice. The implication was not collaboration, but instruction passed through channels that left no paper trail or knowledge obtained through means no one had wanted to record. What disturbed archivists most was not that the boy had been photographed twice, but that both images treated the hand as the true subject. The child himself felt almost incidental, a vessel carried from place to ensure that whatever the hand represented was captured more than once, from more than one source, as though redundancy was essential. The existence of the second portrait transformed the first from an anomaly into evidence, suggesting a deliberate effort to preserve something that could not be trusted to survive in a single image. Of the final truth did not arrive as a revelation, but as an accumulation of smaller, more unsettling confirmations that aligned too neatly to dismiss. Records of the boy's family were scarce, but what existed formed a pattern of abrupt erasure. Parish registers listed births and baptisms, then fell silent after the year the photographs were taken. Property documents showed a modest home sold below value under unclear circumstances. A marginal note in a municipal ledger referred obliquely to an incident requiring discretion, followed by a change in handwriting, as if the original clerk had been replaced mid-entry. No deaths were formally recorded, yet the family's name vanished from every subsequent census. It was not loss, it was removal. Oral histories preserved fragments that written records avoided. In towns linked loosely to the boy's movements, local stories spoke of a household touched by something that should not be named, of neighbors who stopped visiting, of a mother who asked the same question repeatedly, as if hoping the answer might change. These accounts were inconsistent in detail but identical in outcome. Anyone who described the child too precisely, especially his hand, was said to suffer a rapid unraveling of circumstance, illness without diagnosis, reputations undone by rumor, sudden departures undertaken without explanation. The stories were never framed as curses, only as consequences, the natural result of speaking about something that resisted being fixed in words. A single, deeply buried letter offered the closest thing to an explanation. Written by a minor historian whose career ended abruptly, it warned a colleague against completing the description, insisting that certain observations, once committed to ink, did not remain passive. The language was careful, almost apologetic, but the fear beneath it was unmistakable. The writer claimed that the boy's hand was not merely unusual, but referential, pointing beyond itself, and that to define it too clearly was to invite recognition from whatever it echoed. The letter ended with a plea for restraint, followed by a postscript written days later in a shakier hand, stating only that silence was not cowardice but survival. When viewed together, the historians' long-standing reticence took on a different meaning. Their silence was not born of superstition or academic conservatism, but of precedent. Those who spoke plainly did not publish follow-ups. Their notes stopped. Their work remained unfinished. The pattern was subtle enough to escape notice until examined in hindsight, a trail of interrupted leaves connected by a single, shared subject. The photographs themselves seemed to support this logic. The boy's hand, preserved with such care, existed safely within the bounds of the image, contained by chemistry and glass. The danger lay not in seeing it, but in naming it, in reducing it to explanation. To enlarge the hand was permitted, to analyze it was tolerated. But to speak of what it implied, without indirection or omission, crossed a line generations of scholars had learned to recognize without ever articulating it. Silence, maintained over more than a century, was the final method of preservation, ensuring that whatever the hand signified remained trapped where it could do no further harm, except to those who forgot why no one had ever dared to say exactly what they saw